Hi everyone, and welcome to this UPF lecture. Tonight we're having a collaboration with Sasnet. Before we begin, I'll just remind you that tonight we have a pub night, being EU, so please join us after the lecture. But yes, tonight we have Dibyesh here, who is the at the Department of Politics and International Relations in the University of Westminster, also with a long track record of research on Tibet. So please give him a big
Thank you very much. If I not use the microphone, can you hear me at the back? Okay, good. So thank you to Sasnet and Association of Foreign Affairs for inviting me here. In fact, the topic was supposed to be on China and Tibet, and for some reason I realized that the topic that was circulated also included the role of India. So I will cover role of India, I'll cover all of these topics, and during question answer, if you want, we could expand on certain specific issues. But I'll be covering both China, India and Tibet. I'll be covering all of those aspects. Now, in terms of, let's keep one thing in mind, that when we talk of any particular entity, say China, Tibet or India, we usually assume that these entities were there, are there and will be there forever. When in reality, history and geography tells us that nation states evolve, or rather political entities evolve, and what was there in the past might not be there in the future. And this is something important to keep in mind, because most of international relations starts on the assumption that the nation states that are there today will be there forever. So in this context, when we are talking of, let's say, China and Tibet, China, Tibet and India, if I talk of this subject in China, it will be seen as a problem, because I'm talking of Tibet as if it's separate from China, because I'm talking of China, Tibet. I've had this experience in Beijing where I was invited to give a talk on, the topic that I suggested was China's public diplomacy and Tibet. Right? So how China wants the world to think about Tibet. The title was China's public diplomacy and Tibet. I was told that I cannot have that topic because it assumes that Tibet is not part of China. So the title was changed to China's public diplomacy and China's Tibet, which was an awkward topic, but I accepted it because that was part and parcel of my ethnographic research. Because I was actually trying to understand how the Chinese state and different bureaucracies there, and I'm talking for, this lecture was at China Tibetology Research Center, which is in Beijing. It is connected to United Front Work Department. Right? So China, Tibet and India. We have to keep in mind that, again, if you take example of the physical map of Asia, the region that stands out most clearly is actually Tibetan Plateau. So you would assume that Tibetan Plateau is somehow a different country. But in reality, on political map, or rather on political map, Tibet does not exist anymore. So we are talking about, therefore, I'll be discussing history, I'll also be discussing present and discussing a bit of future. But I said, if I'm trying to cover a lot, I would end up talking a bit about every topic rather than going into in depth. But I've worked on this subject for last 18 years now. So again, if you have any questions, criticism, please feel free to address that to me. The wider context, of course, today is, in the world, we are talking of changing geopolitics. We are talking of China's rise, India's rise. We are talking of rise of non-Western powers. So we talk in terms of the rise of these powers in terms of geo-economic strength. So China becoming one of the largest economy, India becoming one of the largest economy. We talk of rise of these countries in terms of diplomacy, military strategy. So in general, we cannot talk of the world today without taking into account India and China. And this is quite different from 20-25 years ago, where hardly anyone paid attention to China and India. In that context, we have to understand that we are talking of, when we talk of usually China and India, we talk in terms of rise, emergence, global powers, regional powers, but that's the kind of language we talk of. And usually in international relations, the focus is on whether these powers, and specifically whether China is a revisionist power or not. Means, is it a power that's going to accept the international law and international norm, or is it going to try to change those norms? Because in the past, it was assumed that if you have a revisionist power against the status quo power, which in this case is US, you'll have a revisionist power being more violent and trying to change the rules. So the question is whether it will do that or not. Those are the kind of things that are talked about in international relations. It's seen in terms of the global footprint of these countries, and that's what this talked about. The issue of domestic politics, the issue of security, nationalism, transformations within, how does the party state, and I'm talking China in particular, how does the party state function? Is the party state, and I'm using the word party state deliberately, because we have to keep in mind that the 1982 Constitution of China places the party above everything else. So we are dealing with a particular context where the Communist Party is beyond scrutiny. So we have got People's Republic of China, which in reality is Party Republic of China. You cannot take the party to the court, because the court itself is connected to the party. You cannot appeal to an independent military against party's misrule, because the PLA is actually the military wing of the party initially. So we are therefore talking about a particular state which is a party state. And yet, we have to keep in mind that it's a party state that has evolved a lot in last 60, 70 years. So we have to look into that also in terms of how has it evolved. For instance, people usually talk often of where they look at Mubarak, and they look at Hosni Mubarak, and they looked at Syria, they looked at Egypt, and sometimes wondered, would we have similar kind of spring in China? The reality is that the kind of family dominance that exists in Egypt or in Syria does not exist in China. Now it's not absent, but there's no one family that dominates. We know that after Mao and Deng Xiaoping, there is no leader, except possibly Xi Jinping now, but there is no leader that can dominate forever. So there is this idea of 2 terms for the leader and then them retire. So this has essentially implied a certain kind of bureaucratization of Communist Party. Communist Party by its very nature is a revolutionary party and ought to be a revolutionary party, right? Because it's a Communist Party. And yet what we have seen in China is there's a bureaucratization of Communist Party. It's a bureaucracy. It's a bureaucracy, and the numbers vary between 70 to 80 million people. So we are talking of a large or medium-sized country, more than Sweden, possibly the size of Germany or UK. So when we are talking that size of a political party, it's very difficult to generalize about it and stereotype about it. And yet, all the evidence points out that while there might be differences within the party, and it's very clear there are differences within the party, contrary to what some scholars talk about in terms of collapse of China, collapse of Communist Party and everything, there is no evidence of the Communist Party imploding. There is no evidence of the party going against its own interest for anything else. That anything else could be democratization, it could be more authoritarianism. Because the Chinese system is not a totalitarian system. It's an authoritarian system. It's democracy with socialist characteristics. This is the kind of definition they use. And I would also say, what is socialism? And interesting part is when you look at the Communist Party's argument today of what makes it socialist, what makes it socialist and communist is the name of the party. Nothing else. So there is no evidence, for instance, that the Communist Party is actually communist. Because one aspect of communism, those of you who would have studied, and if you're not, you should study in any case, communism is always the idea of revolution, speaking for the workers. But you are dealing, or we are dealing with a state where workers' rights are largely negligent, or where it is the party that decides what the workers' rights should be. So even and when you look at the ways in which Communist China, and I'm talking Communist Party, was one of the first major country to actually engage with the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who in 2002 was accused of presiding over massacre of minority Muslims. So in 2002, there was a large-scale massacre of minority Muslims in his province of Gujarat in India. He was denied visa to US. He would not get visa to the UK. Right? So there was this idea that he's connected to a semi-fascist Hindu nationalist party and he should be sidelined. The only major country that not only allowed him, that wooed him and worked with him was China. So you had a very strange phenomenon, or rather not so strange phenomenon, of China, which is supposedly a communist country, Communist Party dominated, dealing with and engaging with a Hindu chauvinist party, which is semi-fascist. I'm giving you that example because I did raise that issue in Beijing about how could they justify engaging with almost a fascist party. And the response was, we do not interfere in internal affairs of other countries. So it goes back to the Stalinist idea of building socialism in one country rather than Leninist, Marxist, or even Trotskyite idea of world revolution or something beyond that. So these are kind of things we are talking about. Anyway, that was a digression. But broadly speaking, we do need to understand that to get the sense of China as an international actor, we also need to understand what's happening domestically. And one of the aspects domestically, apart from other things, is of course rapid economic development with various crises, but the legitimacy of the Communist Party being no longer communism, but something else. That something else is that rapid economic development, which is never permanent. So therefore, the second legitimizing factor in the case of China we notice is use of nationalism. So what we find, of course, is China or Chinese state using nationalism effectively or to a great extent in order to keep people largely disciplined. Those transformations are taking place. But of course, in India also, the similar kind of nationalisms exist. And when we talk of nationalism, different kinds of nationalism, you have Han chauvinism, you have Hindu nationalism, then you have got minority nationalism. Those are the kind of things that are taking place. In case of China, again, we have to keep something in mind that people talk about, we are talking 1.3 billion people. Tibetans are 6 million. Uyghurs are a lot more. But minorities are very small in proportion. But China has this dilemma, or rather peculiarity, of the majority of territory being homeland of minority, and minority of territory being occupied by the majority population. So when you look at what is broadly Tibetan land, Tibetan regions, you have got what we would call East Turkestan or Xinjiang, so Uyghur dominated, or even Mongolians, right? So what we find is that majority of territory belongs to them, or is considered by them to be the homeland. And this is a serious security concern, because that is seen as security concern by China, because it recognizes that while the Han are the dominant majority, of course you've got 55 other nationalities, and China has that multinationality policy, but those minority nationalities are never seen as equal. They get privileges, certain privileges, right? So there's favoritism for them. But it's on the grounds of certain form of paternalism, that those minorities are not as advanced as Han, and therefore they have to be made as advanced as Han. And the language used is of brotherhood. And Han are always the elder brother, never the younger brother. And in certain contexts, the elder brother and younger brother also is language of paternalism. That's what we find. But what we find in China, and there is a big challenge the Chinese state faces, is of course what it calls separatism, and what many minorities, or rather what Chinese call minority, and what people see as occupied nations, they see in terms of ethno-nationalism. We have got, of course, Xinjiang, East Turkestan, you have got there, you have got Tibet, and Tibet will be my main focus. Of course, the images are not only from Tibet, that's the first one, but also from India, where in recent times, there was self-immolation as a form of protest. In 2009-2010, when self-immolation started as a form of protest, one of the initial strategies used by the Chinese state was to declare it as terrorism. But then they stopped calling it terrorism because they realized that how stupid it sounds to anyone else, where people are burning themselves up, they're not burning anyone else up. So it's not that a monk is going and hugging a Chinese soldier and killing. They're burning themselves up, right? So that's a form of protest, but that is not the only form of protest, because since 1956, since 1956, every 10 to 15 years, there have been uprisings in Tibetan regions. So this is one of the more recent form of protest that's taking place. Of course, in the West, I'm talking broadly of the West, focusing largely on UK, US, but other countries are there. Of course, towards China, there are different kinds of approaches. There's this Sinophobia, China threat, China is rising, it's going to be dangerous, and of course, there's also Sinophilia. Love for China, and I'm giving example of UK, which in recent times has made it very clear that UK wants to be the best friend and best partner for China in Europe. Then you have to start asking, what does it actually mean? It means that British government, which is a right-wing government, which doesn't like public sector, right? So the idea you privatize everything, they don't like public sector, but they're willing to sell nuclear power plants to a Chinese public sector. So again, we are dealing with a situation where the domestic capital is not recognized as, domestic public service is not trusted to manage economy, but you can get Chinese public sector to be involved. So they are doing that, and we had situation where at various times, health minister said that, British workers should be more like Chinese workers, so we have to learn from the Chinese workers. What he meant, of course, then he clarified, was they should work hard. So somehow British people don't work hard and Chinese work hard. What he conveniently ignored is essentially that, of course, Chinese workers have fewer rights than the British workers do, and therefore he wants the British workers to accept a situation where rights get eroded. Later he said he was not being racist because his wife is Chinese. That's what his rationale was. Anyway, but you find both, so it's not only one. In terms of China-India relations, very briefly, they had various problems, but you have got strong cooperation economically. China is the largest trading partner of India, but remember, China is the largest trading partner of most countries in the world. But in that context, that's what it is. There's also competition. Both of them see themselves as rising. You've got conflict due to border. And in certain contexts, India and China both have political choice to make in the future. Would they cooperate more? And they do cooperate in various areas. Or will they compete? Or will they have conflict? All these things exist together. In certain form of tension, in India and in China both, it is seen in strategic terms again. So India, for instance, sees itself as being surrounded by China in terms of encirclement. So they use the word idea of it's being encircled by China. Why? Because of China has good relation with Pakistan, it has good relation with Sri Lanka and other countries, and they are building different kind of bases. They're not military bases so far, but they're building bases. So India perceives it as being surrounded. Now, of course, China perceives being surrounded by Japan, Vietnam, India, and others who are allies of US. So there's this whole idea of mutual suspicion. You've got water resources. Most major rivers of Asia, many major rivers of Asia, come from Tibet, including India, and that's seen as in terms of water war, hydro war, because, for instance, all the dams that are being built in Tibet and rivers that affect India, there is no international treaty by which China is governed or is held accountable. In that sense, so these people are talking about hydropower or hydro war in the future. I said one key reason is China-Pakistan relation, and that's what India perceives as a problem. But I want to focus on the fact of when we talk of in international events, China, Pakistan, China, India, US, Vietnam, we forget the fact that historically, India as it exists today did not exist. China as it exists today did not exist. What was India before 1947 was British India. And British India did not have relation with China in the region. It had relation with China separately, but it had relation with Tibet. So what I would argue is that at the heart of this competitive and suspicious relation with India and China lies the history of disappearance of traditional Tibetan state. The Tibetan state that existed disappears. Now, whether one argues and accepts the Chinese version that the traditional Tibetan state was somehow part of China, or accept the Tibetan argument that Tibetan state was actually independent, does not change the fact that there was a traditional Tibetan state. Am I clear? See? Do I need to slow down? Hope no, anyway. Good. Now in 1954, see, when I made the argument that China claims that it should not interfere in internal affairs of other countries, and that is the basic aspect of Chinese foreign policy. Respect for territorial integrity and mutual respect and non-interference. That is also the fundamental principle of foreign policy of India. So both India and China in 1954 signed an agreement which India and elsewhere was called Panchsheel Agreement. It was based on 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Right? So both for post-colonial India and revolutionary China, that 1954 agreement was crucial because for the first time they put in public and through treaty the 5 principles that would govern foreign policy not only vis-a-vis each other but vis-a-vis the world. So non-interference. It's very important. But what most scholars also forget or ignore or are not even aware is that the treaty of 1954 was this, and this was what it called Agreement between People's Republic of China and the Republic of India on trade and intercourse between Tibet region of China and India. You see, this was the last international treaty where Tibet was mentioned. Of course, it says Tibet region of China, but Tibet word exists. That's the last treaty. So the reason I am pointing this out is because later both Indian and Chinese scholars conveniently forgot or conveniently ignored that the treaty was not about how India and China should relate to each other, about their trade and relation. It was about how Tibet should continue to have economic relations with India while being recognized as part of China. Now, why would China sign this agreement? Because 90% of trade of Tibet was with India and Nepal. Right? So economically, today of course you know that China claims that it subsidizes Tibet. It pays a lot to Tibet to keep it part of Tibet and it subsidizes. So the idea is Tibet is completely dependent on Beijing. So there's a lot of subsidy that goes on. So the question to ask is that subsidy, is that economic dependence natural? And the argument used in Beijing is, it is natural because Tibet is a difficult terrain and of course Beijing being a good government and everything, they are giving a lot of money. But the reality as that in 1950s itself is, that 90% of trade of Tibet was with India. Its economy was dependent on what was British India and Nepal and not with China. So it was made dependent on China through processes of colonization, and I'm using the word colonization, and by severing relation between India and Tibet. And that happened not by China's design only, it also happened because India was willingly part of it. In 1951, basically China and Tibet signed 17-point agreement by which Tibet became part of or got recognized sovereignty of China under duress, but it recognized sovereignty, and China in return argued that it would allow the Dalai Lama's government to function and not bring in reforms until Tibetans were ready. Right? So that was the agreement. In 1959, Dalai Lama flees into exile. So between 51 to 59, there's accommodation. The PLA, the rise for PLA did not come via China, it went via Calcutta and Darjeeling. It went via the port of Calcutta because economically, for China to manage Tibet, it needed support of India, and India did allow. I'm giving these snippets of history to remind you, therefore, that when we see present and we see it as taken for granted that China is a big power, Tibet is poor, and therefore Tibet needs China, we forget the history part where in reality Tibet had not needed China at any point in time. Anyway, now why would India, for instance, have a treaty and then withdraw from that treaty and end that treaty? Because of course India and China had a border dispute. Now border dispute, and I'll explain that to you very briefly later, but border dispute is also connected with Tibet because the border, and there is still no agreement by the way between India and China on the boundary. The boundary agreement was a result of a secret treaty signed by the British and Tibetans in 1913-1914. 1913-14, for those of you who know Chinese history, was collapse of Qing Empire and nationalists coming to power. Republic of China. So Republican China went and did that agreement. Now the Tibetan argument is there were three parties to the treaty and agreement. The top, Shimla top, China, Tibet, and Britain, which implied that Tibet was recognized as independent. And the Chinese argument is that they don't recognize Tibet as independent, but they still had gone for the conquest. But it is through that treaty that this boundary agreement was signed. China had not approved, but it was not even aware because it was a secret agreement, and even Tibetans approved on the grounds that Britain will help them against China. So, in 1959, Dalai Lama did make an argument. This is the boundary, right? So we are talking boundary here. These are disputed boundaries. So this is under Indian control, that's under Chinese control. So what we're dealing with is, of course, Chinese claiming what is under Indian control and India claiming what is under Chinese control, and both presenting their position as the natural position. Now, in this region, what we find is when Dalai Lama fled in 1959, he also made it very clear at one point in time that India's claim to this region, and India controls it, right? India's claim is based on recognizing Tibet as independent. Because India can't claim that territory as its Indian until and unless it recognizes the Treaty of 1914, which would imply recognizing Tibet as independent, and Tibet having the treaty making power. And what we find, of course, is India doesn't recognize Tibet as independent. It doesn't want to take that responsibility, but wants and is willing to take that territory and claim that to be Indian. That was the position. Now, right, so in India, of course, there's boundary war, and I can discuss that with you. In 1962, both India and China had a war. India lost that war, but China left those territories and went back because part of it was not to take the territory, but to show to India that it can defeat India, and of course show to the rest of the world that in Asia you can't have two major powers together, and China is more powerful than India. Right? Those are things. Again, we can discuss that later if you want. Now, broadly, what we find is in 19th century, and the current politics of India towards Tibet has to be understood partly in response to what the British policy towards Tibet was. In 19th century, Britain saw Tibet as sort of buffer against hostile power. Right? So Tibet was seen as a territory that's very difficult to manage, and it will prevent the Russians from coming in. Now, interestingly, the British did not see Chinese as hostile power. They saw Russians as hostile power, and they didn't see Japanese as hostile power. Right? Again, I've done that work in an article many years ago on how, and I call the British policy towards Tibet as strategic hypocrisy, where it recognizes Chinese suzerainty, not sovereignty, suzerainty, but Tibetan autonomy, which essentially implies that if Tibet is largely independent, then deal with it. If it's not independent, then deal with China. But they would not recognize Tibet as independent because that would imply taking responsibility for it. Now, Tibetan situation is similar to that of Mongolia. Both were part of Qing Empire. Right? Both Mongolian regions and Tibetan regions are part of the Qing Empire in some form. Not direct under direct rule, but they are part of it. Right? Now, what Russians did was, Russians and then Soviet Union, they encouraged the recognition of what was called Outer Mongolia, which is now Mongolia, as semi-independent. The Mongolians adopted modern notions of nationalism and declared independence. Now, Tibetans had British to deal with, and British did not do what Russians did. So, in context, what you find is historically the relation of Mongolia with China is similar to the relation of Tibet with China. But Tibet did not become independent, Mongolia became independent, and that's largely to do with two factors. One is role of Britain vis-a-vis Russia, and second is role of modern nationalism. Mongolians at that point in time, early 20th century, became nationalists very quickly and modernized. In case of Tibet, because of the Lama system and the dominance of the religious hierarchy, that was not possible. I can again explain that to you later if you want. But what you find is Tibet signing that agreement with Britain on the condition that Britain is going to help it. British being British, which is rather sly in various forms, I mean that's what how empires function. What they did was, and you have to this map. Now this part specifically was under Tibetan control. So you have to think of why would Tibet give up territory to Britain? Because if you give up territory, you do it in return for something. That something was the offer of friendship. Now, when the Tibet, and I've looked at in great detail, when the Tibetan representative asked for British to put it in writing, that in return for promise of friendship, Tibetans, out of grace and everything, are giving up this territory. The British representative said, don't put that in writing because it's not required. And the Chinese would then claim that we have bribed you. So let it be, but you have to trust us because we're civilized power. So a British promise was based on Britain being a country that's civilized and country that of course deals with fairness. And what happened of course was 1947 onwards, especially 49 onwards, when you had PLA, especially after 49, when you had PLA ready to take over Tibet in United Nations, Britain was one of the first countries that prevented recognition and criticism of China on grounds of self-determination. There are three United Nations General Assembly resolutions on Tibet. All of them mention the cultural and religious rights of Tibetans. They don't mention the political rights of Tibetans. And the two countries that were instrumental in preventing that from happening was Britain and India both. Why would Britain do it? Because it wanted good relation with China. And why would India do it? Because India had its own problem of Kashmir. So if you recognize Tibet, then you also have a problem in Kashmir. So they would avoid that. So I'm just giving an example of how, in recent times, what a rhetoric we have found vis-a-vis China is that, it's West that's encouraging Tibetan independence. British are the ones responsible for creating separatism in Tibet. That was an argument until 2008, practically. But in reality, when China was at its weakest, 1920s and 30s, it was the West that guaranteed the boundary and the territorial integrity of China because they could not agree on who would control various parts. That was the reason. So not that they loved China, it's just that they could not agree on who would control and therefore they wanted it there. And US and UK both were involved in that. Now, the boundary dispute as it comes up is because once the traditional Tibetan state disappears, you have got modern China and modern India both competing to militarize the boundary. And we are dealing with a territory that would be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 meters high. Very difficult. Now on map, if you draw a line with a pen, even with a thin pen, what you'd have is, on ground it would be 6 kilometers. Right? So around 6 kilometers, 3.5 miles or 4 miles. So let's 6 kilometers. Now 6 kilometers line, thick line, on the map, on the ground could imply one peak here and second peak there. And that is what India and China faced when they started implementing what the British and Tibetans signed on the map. That was there. But India's position was initially when India became independent, in fact, I've come up with evidence that Indian government actually asked Britain on what to do. Because they had just taken over. And the advice was, Tibet is not worth antagonizing and creating an enemy to the north. So India did also follow that policy. But Nehru's policy, Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru's policy was that unlike Britain, which saw Tibet as buffer, some sort of buffer between enemy power and India, Nehru saw presence of Dalai Lama in Tibet as buffer. Means, so long as Dalai Lama is in Tibet, Chinese are not going to occupy entire Tibet and militarize it. And partly he was correct. Large-scale militarization only took place after Dalai Lama came into exile in 1959. That's what he was. And then over time, the Indian government policy today is very clear that they see the presence of Tibetans in India as some sort of security guarantee. And I'll expand that later. Right? But the region we are talking of, we have to keep in mind that this region was a zone of cooperation. Right? It did not follow the modern principles of sovereignty and boundaries, and yet those are the principles that were imposed on the region. This is from Tawang, one of the regions, of the second largest monastery. What has happened in that region, and I've been to that region in the past, is there's a normalization within India. So India claims it and it has normalized by calling it as India. So you find everywhere, I am the eye of India and everything. So you find a strong nationalism there through various means. But nationalism in that region is a hybrid of Tibetan and Indian nationalism. So Dalai Lama and Dalai Lama's presence is crucial. The reason that region is broadly speaking pro-India is because India gave refuge to Dalai Lama. See, what you find is the Himalayan region, a lot of them, even when they're not Tibetan, some of them are not. There might be Ladakhi, Bhutanese, Sikkimese and others who follow some form of version of Tibetan Buddhism. They would see, of course, China as a problem because China is the one that occupied Tibet and it led to exile of Dalai Lama. So presence of Dalai Lama in India is some sort of security guarantee therefore for India. But that's what's happened. Now in terms of Tibet, again, there's a whole debate about where exactly is Tibet. Is it this side, which is Tibet Autonomous Region, or is it larger region which includes these parts, which is largely the Tibetan homeland? There's disagreement between Dalai Lama and Tibetans and Chinese government on what to call Tibet. But interestingly, even in Chinese government's own policies, not when it's negotiating with Dalai Lama, but in own policies, they will talk of Tibet and Tibetan regions. And they would include not only TAR, which is Tibet Autonomous Region here, but they also include other regions that are Tibetan. So they have similar policy there. Now the reason why Tibet is important for China, you have to understand why it's important, of course, and it's very sensitive and hypersensitive, I would say, is partly resources and exploitation. Tibet is rich in resources, no doubt. And that's one of the arguments that's used. Minerals, water, this there. But I would argue that it's not resources that makes China hypersensitive about Tibet. Even without resources, they would still be they would still make the claim because the second strategic location is vulnerability. Mao in 1940, even before PRC was formed, did talk of Tibet as a weak point vis-a-vis invasion from the south. So that's strategic importance, there's resource exploitation. I would argue that the key reason, of course, is nationalism. So even if Communist Party somehow disappears and China becomes democratic in multi-party form, I don't think that Chinese nationalism is going to transform to a great extent where Tibet would no longer be seen as part of China. Because modern Chinese nationalism imagined China to include regions including in that of Tibet. Right? Sun Yat-sen, Five Fingers, Han, Hui, Mongol, Manchu, Tibetan. Of course, there was no consultation with Tibetans in this context. When China invaded, or let's say when PLA went into or liberated, whatever language you want to use, when China, let's say PLA liberated Tibet, there was no Tibetan who was member of PLA. And there were hardly any Tibetans who were part of the Chinese Communist Party. They became part of the party later. What I'm trying to argue is that Chinese nationalism, the way it was imagined in early 20th century, included Tibetan regions, and therefore Tibet has to be part of China, according to that logic. Right? It's also about legitimacy of the regime. And this is something Tibet is peculiar compared to other regions. In Beijing, you've got China Tibetology Research Center, you've got China Tibetan Medicine, and I've got all the evidence, I've spent a lot of time there. You've got China Tibetan festivals. Now you don't come across China Beijing, you don't come across China Xinjiang. I'm not aware of that. China Shanghai. But China's Tibet always have to have China's Tibet. What I'm therefore arguing is that this paranoia and this obsession to call Tibet China's Tibet is partly a response to the exile Tibetan move to internationalize Tibetan issue. It's partly a response to the fact that we are talking of Tibet here and elsewhere. But that is why it's said. It's part of legitimacy. So since 2009, patriotic re-education campaign, all Chinese had to undergo patriotic education campaigns during Cultural Revolution. It was there. In 1990s, number of them had to undergo, but from what I'm aware of, largely patriotic education campaign at large scale is still taking place in Tibet Autonomous Region, and patriotic education campaign essentially implies denouncing the Dalai Lama. So on one hand, China claims that it offers right to worship, it offers religious freedom to Tibetans, and yet it bans the picture of Dalai Lama and worship of Dalai Lama. Now, for those of you who would not understand the importance, so I always use this example of, how important Dalai Lama is. Imagine if you're a Muslim, and you said you are allowed to be Muslim, but you can't believe in Allah, or you can't have Quran in your house, right? So it's that level, because Dalai Lama is not only the religious and political leader, his manifestation of the protector deity of Tibet, is not a prophet, is more than a prophet, is not a son of God like Jesus Christ, he is the God. So he is the sacred, right? So what I'm trying to argue therefore, that saying that there is religious freedom but we cannot allow Dalai Lama's worship because it's political, goes against the very premise of Tibetan Buddhism, which includes the worship of manifestations of, in this case, Bodhisattva of compassion. Again, I can explain that if you want later. But since 2009, there's a holiday in Tibet Autonomous Region which is called on Serfs Emancipation Day. The serfs, feudal serfs in the past, have to be reminded that they have been liberated by Communist Party since 2009. Of course, they were liberated in 1951 to 59. But the idea is you have to remind them again and again. Again, what I'm trying to therefore argue, there is a propaganda warfare going on within China, within Tibet, and outside about what is the nature of China's rule. But broadly speaking, I say China's paranoia. Because China is an immensely powerful country. Tibetans are very small in numbers. China can afford very easily to be more accommodative and give more rights to Tibetans than they have right now. And that could also include dealing with Dalai Lama, who is asking for genuine autonomy within PRC. He is not asking for independence. They can afford to do it, but they won't do it because, of course, I would say, its paranoia stems from the nature of the Chinese state, which is, it is a colonial state. While China and India also, because some of you who know my work elsewhere, I've looked at also India. In fact, currently I'm looking at the colonial practices of India in Kashmir and China and Tibet. There's a lot of similarities. I can expand Kashmir if you want later. But both these countries claim to be post-colonial, right? Anti-colonial. They're victims of colonization. But when you look at the policies they follow in Tibet, in Kashmir, they are nothing but colonial. Right? What you have at the basis is asymmetry of power. Colonization, I can expand for that for you later if you want. Colonization is essentially about alien control, alien territorial control, alien rule, asymmetry of power. So if I'm colonizing you, we can never be equal. Right? So that's the idea. It also includes knowledge production, producing knowledge about the colonized. It includes economic control. So take example of Tibet, of course. There's a magazine called China's Tibet, produced by United Front Work Department since 1988, 1989. It's a long-term magazine. It's a public diplomacy magazine. When I had a cursory look at all the issues of China's Tibet since 1988-89, I've got all the copies. There's not a single picture of a Tibetan who's not smiling. So you always have to have a smiling Tibetan. Now, every language used by Tibetans who are part of the system and others, that Tibetans are grateful to Beijing for whatever it happens. So the relation is an asymmetry one, and of course in 1992, in its honesty, in English, when the white paper was published on Tibet by the Chinese government, it was called Tibet, its ownership and human rights situation. Ownership. I'm leaving, and I'm assuming you can see the problem with the language of ownership. We are talking of a country that claims ownership over territory and population and the people. Right? It's always about being grateful, being thankful. And that is, as you know, aspect of colonization, that is about paternalism. Colonization is never about brutal military control only. It includes paternalism. Right? You have political control, of course. This is in the photo I had taken in Tibet, right? Mao, Chairman Mao here, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and of course I'm sure by now you have got Xi Jinping and others also, and Hu Jintao will be there. This is an altar room, by the way. It was near Lhasa. So what I found very interesting was that in model villages and model houses, you always have the Communist Party leaders' pictures in the altar, prayer altar, thanking them. And of course, an interesting question to ask is, do they also have a bedroom? So because the reason I'm pointing this out is because there's this obsession of always thanking the Chinese government or Beijing for whatever is happening in Tibet. And that for me is the nature of colonization, which is paternalism. So they always have to be thankful. Of course, colonization includes, and I can expand that later here, but I don't have time here, control over bodies of all forms, incarceration, arrest, arbitrary arrest. Rule of law, we can talk about rule of law, except that party is above the rule of law. Because we are talking a system where party is above everything. Control over bodies, living bodies, dead bodies, and lo and behold, control over manifestations. Dalai Lama is a manifestation. He's a reincarnation. Now, does anyone know what reincarnation is? Anyone here? Okay, do you know rebirth? In Buddhism and Hinduism, this whole idea of rebirth. So we all are parts of rebirth. I might be a cat in the previous life, hopefully you a cat, not anything else. I was a cat, then I take rebirth, I die, I take rebirth. So we are all caught in the karmic cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Right? That's karmic cycle. But we don't know what happens. Tibetan Buddhism, and it's not all Buddhism, it's Tibetan Buddhism, came up with a peculiar concept where certain enlightened beings are aware of who they were in the past. Now, they are enlightened beings, therefore they will be Buddha, they will be the enlightened ones. But they decide not to leave the world and not to escape the cycle of birth and rebirth because the world needs them. So long as there is injustice in this world, they'll keep taking reincarnation. So, Dalai Lama is a reincarnation. So he is the 14th Dalai Lama. He is therefore the 13th Dalai Lama and he is the 14th Dalai Lama. So body changes, but the manifestation remains the same. Too complicated for you? But anyway, it's I guess the same person. So it is the Dalai Lama. So first, second, third, fourth, all Dalai Lamas are the same. You've got Panchen Lama, you've got other Lamas, and of course between 2,500 2,800 reincarnated Lamas are there in Tibet right now and outside Tibet. But Dalai Lama is the most senior one, and second is Panchen Lama. Now, the Chinese government has come up with a policy and they have made it very clear that, and they call it living Buddha in English. There can be no reincarnation without the permission and authorization of the Chinese government. Right? Now we are dealing with the situation where a communist party, which is by its very nature atheist, otherwise you can't be communist. Okay, you will be hidden religious, but you can't. So you have a communist party claiming to be the authority on reincarnation. Of course, the historical precedent they are using is that in case of Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama in the past, the Qing Empire had something called golden urn system. So the idea is there would be three different, it's a long process, but three different candidates' name would be there, and the emperor or the representative of emperor would pick up the final one, or would be present while it's being picked up. Now the Tibetan argument is that the Qing emperors were Buddhists. They were actually Tibetan Buddhists. They were not Tibetan, but they were Tibetan Buddhists. So it made sense for the emperors to be involved because they were Buddhists. And once that connection is gone, so how can a non-Buddhist be an expert or recognized? So that's the rationale that's it. But in recent times, it's going more bizarre, I have a feeling, is because Dalai Lama has said, of course, various ways, I could take, maybe I will not reincarnate, maybe I'll reincarnate as a woman. But he has made it something very clear. He said, I will not reincarnate in Tibet so long as the political situation is not resolved. That is clear. Now, Zhu Weichun, who happens to be the key person who led the Chinese delegation during negotiation, who is seen as one of the hardliner ones, has made it very clear. The Chinese government has repeated it, that the Dalai Lama has no right not to reincarnate. Right? And they have made it very clear that he has to reincarnate. And he should not interfere in traditional matters of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, of course, it goes back to, of course, the political power. It goes back to Panchen Lama, who would be the second highest Lama in Tibet. The previous Panchen Lama, who stayed inside Tibet, stayed in China, he did not flee, and he did not come to Israel. He worked with the Chinese government, and he was, for that, put into prison for years. But then he was also moved out. During the process of his reincarnation, you had a situation of division between Dalai Lama and Chinese government, and this boy who was recognized as Panchen Lama by Dalai Lama is called the world's youngest political prisoner since 1995. He's not in power. And Chinese government recognized Anand boy as Panchen Lama, and he's the one who's been sort of sent around and shown as Panchen Lama. So you got two Panchen Lama. So there is this real possibility of that there will be more than one Dalai Lama, where you have the Chinese government having one candidate and of course exiles having their own candidate. The reason I mention this is because we find this kind of, I think, unprecedented colonization, where there's also the control or the desire to control the manifestation by a party or by a government that does not believe in manifestation. Development is, and of course, one of the arguments is that Tibet has developed, Tibet has railways now, it didn't have railway in the past and all of that, but we have to keep in mind that colonization never included only underdevelopment. It also includes development as a mechanism of control. So you build railways in India, the British built railways in India because through railway you can get more access to market, you get more access to raw materials. So right, that's what's happening. So development is a mechanism of control, but in the end, the reality is violence is integral to exercise of sovereignty of the colonial power over the colony, in this case over Tibet. So without the level of militarization that's there, without the level of surveillance that's there in Lhasa and other parts of Tibet, you cannot understand how China rules there. Now, this is a slide I have just fitted in here. I will take 5 to 8 more minutes. So I think speaking for a lot, 45 minutes or 40 minutes already, studying China. Now, the question is, this is more for us to think of, right? Even for myself, as scholar on China, on Tibet, or India, or whatever, should we adopt a critical perspective of the kind which we adopt vis-a-vis our own system, or should we respect difference and be sensitive? The reason I mention this is because there's a very weird kind of, I would say, racism, and I'm using the word racism deliberately, that prevails in places like UK, where if there's a discrimination against an Indian or Chinese scholar on something, we protest, we say there's discrimination, that's racism. But when the Indian government or Chinese government prohibit, ban, and discriminate against scholars, we keep quiet. So we somehow assume that we have the right to be anti-racist and we should not allow it, but we go quiet whenever those countries do it. So for instance, in case of China, and I'm talking of my own experience, we have been told, and the kind of research I do in Tibet, and I do research in China, but that's why I Tibet, because I'm researching on Tibet but it's supposed to be part of China, so it's also research on China. In the past, no one told me, oh, you are brave in doing your research. Now I'm being told, oh, you're brave for doing the kind of research you do. And of course also in India, with my research on India, on Kashmir and against Hindu nationals, in recent times I've been told in India that you're very brave to do this kind of research because I'm very critical of the Indian government. Right? Now the reason I mention these things to remind us that as scholars we have to go beyond xenophobia, that China threat kind of angle, and also beyond xenophilia, because there can be no genuine research which is not critical. And when we do study sensitive subjects, is it our role? I mean, if Chinese nationalism is sensitive about Tibet, or Indian nationalism is sensitive about Kashmir, is our role as students or scholars to keep quiet because it's sensitive? Or is it to actually say, but how come it became sensitive? Why should it be sensitive? If we talk of equality and human rights here, in Sweden or in UK, how can we not talk of equality and human rights in India, in China? So what I'm trying to argue there is that what we need is a genuine kind of post-colonial scholarship, and I'm assuming that most of us would see colonization as negative, right? And I see it as very negative. So a genuine kind of post-colonial scholarship where we continue to challenge the state and its narratives and privilege people and their narratives, right? Going back to India and China, of course, what we find with India is that in India, you have divided opinion about China. You have got again similar kind of, we have to work with China and we have to, China is an enemy, we have to teach them a lesson, all of those kind of things. But in China also there's a changing role of what role India plays. But largely there's an effort to see India as only a South Asian power, which has no say beyond South Asia. And the way to do that, of course, is closer relation of China vis-a-vis Pakistan. So Pakistan and China relation, the main dynamic there is not resources, not anything except to contain India in certain context. That's what's happening there, right? There have been discussions in Chinese strategic circles of also short war vis-a-vis India, that if India is becoming too close to US, then it needs to have a short war so that we remind India again of who is a stronger power. There are these discussions that take place. China's stance vis-a-vis Nepal and other countries that it wants bilateral relations, and India sees it as in the backyard and therefore it gets sensitive. Those things are taking place. Now vis-a-vis India and Tibet, have your cake and eat it too, and then complain that you have gained weight. That is India's policy vis-a-vis Tibet. Means India is beneficiary, and I'm saying beneficiary. India in the end is beneficiary of Chinese colonization over Tibet, because India got the territory it wanted and it needed, or it acquired, let's say, in the Tawang region. India hardly did anything for Tibetans, and I'm saying hardly, because of course you find Tibetans thanking India all the time for giving refuge to Dalai Lama. But the reality is, Nehru, I mean, if he had not given refuge to Dalai Lama, it would have been a much bigger problem for India. The way in India the policy functions with Tibet, I would say there's broadly three kinds of perspectives. There are those who see Tibet and Tibetans as strategic assets, so let us use Tibetans against China. So that's the only thing we have against China. That's in minority. Then there are those who argue that Tibetans are a liability. India has more than 100,000 Tibetans in exile, and Tibetan government in exile is in India. So this is the view that says we want good relation with China. So let us remove Tibetans somehow from India, and then we would have good relation with China. Now they also know that while Dalai Lama is alive, that would not be possible, because Dalai Lama is very popular. But once he is no longer there, that is a possibility. But third and growing realization is that Tibetans have contributed to India immensely. Not only in strategic terms, territory, not only in terms of let's say cultural resources in the borderland region, but in terms of economy, tourism, in terms of, and I would say, soft power. Today, the biggest proponent of India in international forum is Dalai Lama. It's not Narendra Modi, the fascist Prime Minister of India, who goes abroad and maybe people like him because they think India has money. But the reality is not him. There's no one else apart from Dalai Lama who, if you have heard him speak, I mean, have anyone heard him speak? Anyway, I remember if he is asked what is a good model and how should we operate, he often brings in the idea of secularism in India. He often talks of India as an ideal model. I'm arguing therefore that Dalai Lama offers more to India than what India has provided for Tibet. In that sense, that's what's happening with India and Tibet. But broadly, and the Chinese government is very much aware what happens to the future of Tibet. What we're finding is with colonization in Tibet and in Kashmir and in the entire region is, unlike the European colonization, which became stronger and then started becoming more accommodative and in the end decolonization, vis-a-vis Asian colonization is an ever intensifying colonization. Whatever space was in the past, it keeps shrinking. So what Dalai Lama is asking for today, genuine autonomy within PRC, is much less than what Tibetans had in 1950 through 17-point agreement, and yet they will not get it. They will not get it, and there will be no genuine, that's not prediction by the way. It's unlikely they'll get it because Chinese government doesn't fear Dalai Lama, doesn't fear Tibetans. They can manage Tibetans. 6 million, kill them, kill a few here and there, they can manage. They fear the influence and possible influence of Dalai Lama over the Chinese population, over the Chinese public. Means, if you have heard Dalai Lama speak, if you haven't, please go and listen to him. The kind of language he talks about, he appeals a lot to the common sense. He talks about nice things. He doesn't talk of politics most of the time. Even if he's allowed into Beijing, not Tibet, you will find over time hundreds of thousands of Chinese listening to him, following him, and realizing that what the government was saying about him is actually not true. So my assessment is that the Chinese government will not negotiate with him sincerely and will not allow him to return, not because of his influence over Tibetans, but his possible influence over the Chinese public. Because once he is back, it's very difficult to control the public opinion around him, and that is why they would not. So what we're finding therefore in China is growing power of China, partly also insecure China, but I don't see a proper negotiation in the future. So more brutalization, more dehumanization, more colonization. Vis-a-vis India, we don't know what's going to happen, but they can have more tension in India and China. If they have more tension, then the Tibetan issue will come up. Vis-a-vis West, again, Tibet is an issue they would try to bring up from time to time, but that's not the reality. Reality, when you look at it, West is as eager to work with China as anyone else, because they focus on the short-term gains of economic growth and economic partnership rather than human rights. So who are the biggest victims here? Of course, the biggest victims are the people. Specifically, I'm talking Tibetan people here, and of course others who are colonized. To summarize and conclude, now vis-a-vis India and China, for India, Tibet is a strategic issue. You can bargain over it. Even Dalai Lama is a strategic issue. But the border is a nationalist issue. You cannot, and India is not going to negotiate and not going to give an inch of the borderland because it's already part and parcel of the Indian nationalist imagination. You can't barter and give the part of your motherland, Mother India kind of thing. For China, it's the other way around. Border is a strategic issue over which they can negotiate, but Tibet is a nationalist issue over which they will not negotiate. So the tension between India and China vis-a-vis Tibet and the border is therefore a tension between that nationalist strategic dissonance. Okay. Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
Yeah, I thought it was a very engaging talk, and in response to your question about should academics talk about these things, I think they should, and I'm glad you did. However, I'm a sly Brit, as you mentioned in the talk, and I disagree with you on a couple of things, but I might be out of my depth here. You talked about strategic hypocrisy on the part of the Brits as if it was a negative thing, whereas in 1947, after we had gone through 2 world wars and we were practically bankrupted, if you were looking as a foreign secretary, would you really want to be protecting the interests of another country abroad again and potentially getting into a conflict with a big power like China? I would argue, as a Brit, you would stay out of it, bearing in mind what you've been through the last 20 odd years. And the other thing was, with India, similar thing. Oh no, actually, another 2 things. If Tibet to China is a nationalist thing rather than a strategic thing, then I understand. But I've heard other people talk about the water resources in Tibet as being a major thing for Western China, that they would never give up Tibet because of the water resources, and how that might change their perspective on things. And finally, sorry about this, India, the gist I got was that you expected India to do more for Tibet nowadays. But given that they had a conflict with China in the late 50s or the early 60s and they lost, and the rise of China now, would they want to stoke the fire and potentially provoke another conflict when really the option for order is already there, and maybe they thought let's leave it?
Thank you very much for these 3 questions. Going back to the strategic hypocrisy part, in fact, I'll send you the paper if you want. I looked through from 19th century onwards. Even when Britain was at its peak of power, even then they were following that policy. And in 1920s, for instance, there was this recommendation from British officials based in China to say that Britain should recognize Tibet's independence, because practically Tibet was independent, but it should recognize, because that is in our interest. The British officials in India said we should not recognize it, because if we recognize Tibet as independent, then Tibetans will have the right to engage the Russians and with Japanese and others on their own, and that does not suit our interests. So what I'm saying is, of course, Britain, the way it defined was, they looked after their own narrow national interest. Now you could say that's right, and that's what they should do. I understand that. Yeah. But the point is, but Britain also claimed to take care of Tibetans. But to Tibetans were not aware of this kind of negotiation that was taking place vis-a-vis British officials in India and British officials in China. So Tibetans actually trusted Britain to represent them outside. So they were the only channel for them to deal with League of Nations. And Britain would say, we will deal with it, but of course in their own discussion they said, let us not deal with it because it suits our interests and their mentality. So that's the language. So what I'm trying to argue that was that they promised something but delivered something else. After 47, of course, it's understandable, but we are talking even of 1920s, 30s and 40s. And India followed that policy more or less. The question of India,
the nationalism versus...
Now see, the point is vis-a-vis Tibet, of course, it doesn't, when I say it's a nationalist issue, it doesn't mean it's actually a nationalist issue and there's not strategic element. Both of them are part and parcel of it, right? It's sold as a nationalist issue. Means the differentiation I will make is nationalist issues are shown as emotional. You can't compromise. Right? So in Indian context, the notion is if you talk of the Kashmir being separated, then you're talking of the beheading of Mother India. And how can you talk of beheading of Mother India? You'll be beheaded rather than you being allowed to behead Mother India. Right? It's a very emotional language that they use. Same with China. It's about emotion. But interestingly, Tibet as a core national interest of China in doctrine is a recent phenomenon. Only last 10 years. China did not talk of Tibet as a core national interest. It's something new. Now, see, it is strategically very important. Whatever, water is there. But in 40s, late 40s and early 50s, when Tibet was taken over, was liberated, was occupied, at that time, the water resource, from what we know, vis-a-vis the discussion the Chinese were having with the Russians, because those are at least declassified, the strategic element was seen as less important than the fact that our people expect us to liberate Tibet. So in a certain context, what I'm trying to argue therefore is that there's a common tendency in Tibet, amongst Tibetan exiles and the Western supporters, to put it back on communism. That somehow communists are the evil, when I'm arguing that no, the entire imagination of Chinese nationalism includes Tibet. And that is the dilemma that Tibetan movement faces. So how to engage with it? Now, of course, Dalai Lama offers a non-nationalist alternative, but given nationalism in Tibet and in China, it's very difficult to accept it. Now, vis-a-vis India, yes, I would argue that China should do more to support Kashmiris. India should do more to support Tibet. Why not? Not for strategic purpose. I would say for human rights purpose. Of course, that's being idealistic, because the reality is neither India nor China nor other countries actually care about human rights. Nor do we care about human rights. That's the reality. But I would say they should. And they should at least do more. I'm not saying do more for Tibetans in terms of encouraging anything against China. That would not work. In fact, I'm one of the ones who have said in Delhi that those who say that Tibet is a strategic issue and Indians should somehow encourage Tibetans are going to betray Tibetans and get them killed. So I'm very much against that kind of strategic issue. I would say India should recognize and accept the immense contribution Tibetans already make in India, and therefore make the lives of Tibetans slightly better. I'll give you an example. For instance, there was a case where in 2011, there's a third, going back to Reincarnation, you have Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama and Karmapa. Karmapa is the third highest Lama. He is recognized both by the Chinese government and Dalai Lama. He fled from Tibet in 2000. He was a kid, now he's grown up. There was an accusation against him in Indian media that he's a Chinese spy. Now imagine in a democracy, it's not government that's accusing him of being Chinese, it is the media that declared him a Chinese spy. Later, of course, it came out that was all of it was, basically it was, there's something else going on, they had manufactured it, and no media house ever apologized to him. But it implied that he was sidelined. Then you have a situation of Tibetans being put under more surveillance, because Indians don't trust them. So what I'm arguing is that even at subtle level, Indians or Indian state has to do more to accept what immense contributions Tibetans are making and not to use them against China, but at least accept it. That's what I meant, and India should do. Vis-a-vis war, I don't see it as a solution, because the reality is, if India and China have a war, even short war, I mean, it's unlikely to be a repeat of 1962, which India lost badly, right? Because India was following very odd kind of politics, where they were being belligerent, and India was belligerent. Of course, the myth in India that India was a victim, but India was also belligerent. But India was a unique situation in 1959 to 62, where it was making a lot of claim, but its military budget was going down. Right? So and that's what happened. So now it's unlikely to be defeated, it's unlikely to win. So I don't think it suits anyone's interest to have a war there, but at the very least, India could offer is that provide for a vibrant, dynamic, exile community in India and not make life difficult. Next.
Thanks for your very interesting information. My question to you is about like colonization and this non-engagement policy in relation to I was reading visiting guys a couple of weeks ago when I was traveling, and I did it on Facebook, and then I realized they're like really xenophobic, and there's other thing that they support like this Facebook page which is called the Israel Project. And I was wondering about like in which maybe like China's or and India's policy about Israel, and how do they position themselves to Israel and Palestine.
In both cases, India and China, of course, were the ones that supported Palestine, broadly speaking, traditionally. Right? So traditionally, they would be seen as pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, but since 1990s, all of them have changed their politics where they engage with Israel and Palestinian authorities both. But in recent times, of course, the connection with Israel is stronger than the lip service they provide to the Palestinians. That is the trend in both the countries. Now, vis-a-vis India, again, from 1900, what you find is especially this government, so the BJP, the right-wing Hindu national government, they see themselves as very more closer to Israel. They want to be closer to Israel because, of course, apart from strategic and military and other exchanges, there is that shared Islamophobia, where they fear that, of course, they're surrounded by these hostile Muslim powers, and therefore they need to cooperate with each other. So there is an element of strategy and nation-state changing. So both secular nationalists in India and the Hindu nationalists were getting closer to Israel. But this whole idea of what Israeli project, well, I'm not surprised. Those things, because for the right-wing Hindus or right-wing Hindu nationalists in India, the biggest enemy is not China. The biggest enemy is not even Pakistan. The biggest enemies are Muslims in India. So while the secular nationalists, the Congress, the main party in the past, would see Pakistan as responsible for problems in Kashmir, the Hindu nationalists see the entire Muslims as responsible, and Pakistan as sort of a side element to it. But that transformation is already taking place, and some of you would be aware, many of you may not. Since last 1 year, we find that transformation in India very rapid. Transformation in terms of the news that comes out of beef killing. Have you heard of beef killing? Now, beef killing, of course, normally if I say beef killing, you think beef killing is killing of cow for meat. But beef killing in Indian context is killing of human beings on the accusation that they possess beef. Now, eating beef is not illegal in India, in most parts. Even possessing beef is not illegal. So this killing is done not by the state, this killing is done by the mob, who say that, of course, cow is somehow holy and everything, and mother, and therefore you should not. But what we have found in recent times, of course, is that growing intolerance of various kinds, not only in Kashmir, which is an issue, but also vis-a-vis Muslims and others. That is taking place already. So in that context, they see themselves as somehow naturally closer to what Israel is. And of course, in Kashmir, and by the way, in Tibet also, I'm aware, I remember in 2008 when I was visiting, I found certain things out that, of course, Chinese government is also trying to understand how Israel deals with uprisings in Palestinian territory. And of course, Indian government is very clear that since 1999 specifically, and even before that, and now even more, how to deal with the insurgency in Kashmir. So both of them are trying to learn.
Do we have a last question?
Who will be the winner? I mean, the China and the India, who can not balance the actual people.
See, I mean, it's very clear. Tibet is controlled by China, there's no doubt. And in near future, I mean, we are not 100, 200 years later, but in near future, there is no possibility of that transforming. Right? So that's it. So Tibet, in fact, is very much integrated into and colonized, or whatever language you want to use, as part of China. So the question, therefore, to ask for me is more that what vision of rule and what vision of development will take place in Tibet? Will it continue to be in this form, which is a colonial kind of development, which privileges the state over the people, or is it going to be one where people are privileged over the state? But for me, the wider question, therefore, is not actually Tibet. Chinese government is following policy in Tibet, which is not different from the policy it follows in most parts of China, which is a distrust of people and privileging of the party. But on Tibet, I don't see India having any serious impact in leading to destabilization of the Tibet. But India could do one thing, is to provide a vibrant environment for the exile community to function. But on Tibet, it's very clear that it is largely between Tibetans and the Chinese to resolve how they are going to resolve the relation they have. India has a secondary role.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
Yes, and thank you everyone for coming. And don't forget about the pub night. If you're not sure where Värmland is located, there will be a group.